They left the Smoky Mountains as boys and returned as legends. This is the incredible, true story of David and James Gibson. Our story begins in the shadows of the Great Smoky Mountains in Blount County, Tennessee. It's here, along the clear, rushing waters of Crooked Creek, that two mountain boys named David and James Gibson grew up. From the time they were old enough to walk, the two lads were inseparable. They did their chores together and worked the rocky fields side by side with their pa. And when they weren't helping on the farm, those two boys roamed the virgin forest of Blackberry Mountain. David was a crack shot with a rifle, steady and patient, while James had a gift for tracking animals. Together, these youngsters were a formidable team. Their father even trusted them to put meat on the table while the old man worked the fields. And rarely did those boys come home empty-handed. Whether it was a fat trout pulled from a cold mountain stream, a wild turkey from the backwoods, or baskets heavy with chestnuts, apples, and sweet wild berries, David and James always brought home a bounty straight from Mother Nature's own table. Now David was the older of the two, a strong, good-looking boy with dark hair and deep blue eyes. Now James, well, he might have been younger. Now, but don't let that fool you. He was red-haired, feisty, and full of fire. In fact, the boy looked every bit of the part of their Scottish ancestors. And together, the brothers were always testing each other, whether they were wrestling in a makeshift ring of piled-up leaves or arm wrestling on an old hickory stump that served as their backyard table. James could hold his own, and then some. And like most brothers, occasionally they resorted to fist fights to settle a dispute. But by the day's end, they would always be best friends again. Well, anyhow, the years came and went peacefully as the mountain mist that rose each morning from Crooked Creek. Spring after spring, the world around them bloomed and then faded as the boys grew tall and strong beneath the ever-watchful gaze of the Great Smokies. And before long, the two carefree mountain lads had turned into young men who were standing on the edge of a world that would soon test them in ways their beloved hills never could. That's right. By 1861, the political storm clouds that had been brewing in the outside world beyond those mountains finally unleashed their fury when the bloody war between the states erupted. And now, the very fate of America hung in the balance. No man was safe from the conflict, as each would search his heart and declare his allegiance to one side or the other, and vow to fight for what he believed in. The issue wasn't as clear as modern narratives try to make it. Instead, it was highly controversial, as both sides strongly believed with a burning conviction that they were fighting for liberty and the very soul of the country. Nowhere was this more evident than the mountains of East Tennessee. Neighbors who had once lived peacefully now found themselves sworn enemies as they pledged loyalty to one side or the other. Entire families were ripped apart as sons and even fathers now fought against each other in blue and gray uniforms. There was simply nowhere to hide, as the Civil War would soon become the deadliest war in American history, while claiming 750,000 lives. Like every other man, David and James Gibson responded to the call of duty, and the brothers traded in their mountain life for government-issued rifles when they were sworn in as privates in Company I of the 3rd Tennessee Volunteer Cavalry, fighting for the Union Army. And although they didn't know it, their lives would never be the same again. and they would be involved in one of the most historic events in American history that has nearly been forgotten. On September 25th, 1863, David and James Gibson, along with nearly 500 men under the command of Major A.W. Pickens, were mustered out of Knoxville, Tennessee, and headed south, right into the teeth of the war. The regiment's primary objective was to defend crucial railroads that stretched from Tennessee down into Athens, Alabama, carrying vital supplies for Union troops. Meanwhile, Confederates were hell-bent on stopping those trains that carried food and weapons for the Northern aggressors. And make no mistake about it, Athens was a strategic chess piece in the war that both sides wanted to control. And some of the most ruthless acts during the Great Conflict occurred here, with Union troops looting and burning the town, all while their commanding officers turned a blind eye to the atrocities. Confederate forces sought revenge, and they would soon get it, in the bloodiest battle to ever occur in Alabama during the war. And David and James Gibson? No, well, they would be right in the crosshairs of the chaos. By the fall of 1864, the war had turned the two mountain boys into hardened soldiers. But they stuck together, as they always had, and watched each other's backs. They were among 1,000 men who were stationed at Fort Henderson near Athens, Alabama, along the Nashville and Decatur Railroad. Their job was to guard a vital wooden bridge known as the Sulphur Creek Trestle, a long, rickety span that crossed a deep, rocky valley. That bridge was the weakest link in the entire Union supply line, and both sides, they knew it. Several skirmishes had already been fought over it, but nothing like what was coming. And on the morning of September 25th, all hell broke loose. It started with the distant thunder of hooves and the low rumble of cannon wheels, when nearly 5,000 rebel soldiers, under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, had slipped in during the night and surrounded the fort. By dawn, 8 Confederate cannons were positioned on the high hilltops, overlooking the valley, with their barrels aimed straight down at those Union boys. The first booming shots shook the earth and sent dirt flying into the sky as shells screamed overhead, filling the air with smoke, fire, and the terrible cries of wounded men. The air was deafening with cannon fire, rifle cracks, and the shouts of officers trying to hold the line. The two mountain boys fought with the same grit they had once used back in laurel thickets, but they were completely outmatched. The rebels had the high ground and the numbers. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry charged across open fields, while artillery pounded the fort without mercy. For hours, the Union boys held on, but the position became hopeless. And as the smoke thickened and the dead and the wounded lay on the ground, the order finally came to surrender. David and James, bloodied and exhausted, had no choice but to lay down their rifles alongside their comrades. And just like that, the two brothers were taken prisoner.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today, also available on Amazon.
Hey guys, J.D. Phillips here, and we are here in Pleasant Hill Cemetery in Sevier County, Tennessee, as we continue with the incredible true story of David Gibson.
When the smoke cleared, 200 Union soldiers were dead, and the remaining 800 were taken prisoner as the rebels burned the bridge to the ground. It was the bloodiest day in Alabama history. After their capture, the brothers were marched under guard with hundreds of other Union prisoners southward into the heart of Alabama. Their destination was Cahaba Federal Prison, and for the next 7 long, miserable months, this would be their home. The prison sat at the muddy confluence of the Cahaba and Alabama rivers in South Alabama, What was supposed to be a stockade built to hold about 3,000 men had swollen to nearly 5,000 souls by the time the Gibson brothers arrived. The place was a mosquito-filled hellhole, a crowded, filthy compound of makeshift barracks and open grounds surrounded by tall wooden walls and guard towers. The rivers that flowed nearby brought more misery since they frequently flooded and resulted in the prisoners being forced to stand for days at a time in waist-deep water without food or sleep. And when the water receded, it left behind stagnant pools that bred swarms of mosquitoes that were thick enough to darken the air at dusk. Men slept shoulder to shoulder on the bare ground or on rough plank floors with barely enough room to turn over. Each was given a daily ration of 1.5 pints of uncooked, coarsely ground raw cornmeal and a piece of bacon the size of 2 fingers. Disease ran wild with scurvy and fever, killing dozens of men each month. The summer heat was smoldering, and when winter came, the damp river air cut straight to the bone. During their 7 months in captivity, David and James both lost nearly 50 pounds each and were severely malnourished. But mercifully, the Civil War finally ended on April 9, 1865, when General Lee surrendered. Somehow, the brothers had survived and now were in the process of returning to the mountains they loved so much. The men of the 3rd Tennessee Volunteer Cavalry were shipped to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where they awaited a ship that was large enough to carry them up the river back to their home state. And on April 23rd, they were loaded aboard a steamship named the Sultana and headed north on the mighty Mississippi River. Now, this boat that they were on was licensed to carry a maximum of 376 people. However, the captain of the ship had been offered a staggering $5 for each man he could transport. And with that in mind, he packed 2,289 soldiers on the ship. Once again, they were stacked like sardines, much the same way they had been in prison, as they set out on their fateful journey back to Tennessee. Yet, the trip had bad omens from the very start. You see, the Sultana had originally docked in Vicksburg because its boilers had sprang a leak and needed a major repair that would take 4 days to complete. However, the captain feared that if he waited that long, some other boat would come along and take those soldiers from him. And at $5 apiece, that was over $11,000, an absolute fortune in 1865. So with that in mind, the captain opted for a Band-Aid repair on the boilers. So, severely overloaded, the crippled steamship set out on its journey in the middle of a rainstorm. The next day at 7 a.m., the boat briefly docked at Helena, Arkansas, where many curious citizens hurried to the waterfront to wave at the soldiers. Among the onlookers was a photographer who immediately began to set up his camera, and he took this photo that you're looking at right now. When the soldiers saw that camera, they tried to rush to the rail of the boat to get in the picture, and it caused the boat to lurch 20 degrees to the starboard side, leaving many men dangling in midair. After the photo, the Sultana continued on her voyage up the Mississippi. By the next night, she had finally reached Memphis and stopped to refill her fuel bins. It had been raining nonstop during the entire trip, and the river was severely swollen to about 3 times its normal width on this fateful night. But still, the Sultana carried on, and after the refuel, she once again set sail at 1 a.m. up the muddy river. 30 minutes later, the captain began feeling his way through the Hen and Chicken Islands, an area which, due to the flooding, was extremely hard to navigate. By 2 a.m., they passed Tangleman's Landing when suddenly, without warning, one of the ship's boilers exploded. In an instant, the steamship was ripped in half, with her pilot and pilot house blown away. and hundreds of passengers instantly killed and crippled. Hundreds more of sleeping men were spewed straight into the air and rained down on the burning deck and into the dark, swirling water. Large pieces of iron tore through the cabins as debris rained out of the air. The explosion was followed with a number of sickening sounds: the crunching of stairways collapsing, the crash of the smokestacks falling, the hiss of escaping steam, and the screams of men. The soldiers, assuming that the boat was within yards of the shore, as it had been for most of the trip, they began to jump into the water, when in fact, the captain had been navigating in the middle of the river, which was now flooded to a 9-mile width. The burning boat had no lifeboats and no safety equipment. The men's only choice was to jump or burn with the ship. People on the deck began ripping up every possible piece of wood, anything that would float, and the water was so full of people that it was impossible to jump in without hitting someone. During the chaos, the Gibson brothers had been separated. The explosion severely damaged David's eyes, and he could barely see. He wrapped himself in a blanket to shield himself from the flames and began searching and screaming out for James. But it was all in vain. He was nowhere to be found. Finally, David's clothing caught fire and he was forced to jump into the river that was now a dark, raging torrent. Once in the water, people were fighting for anything they could find to keep them afloat. The weak and the injured were pushed aside and eventually simply sank from sight. By 3:15 a.m., just 75 minutes after the explosion, there was no living soul aboard the Sultana. Over 1,700 men perished during the tragedy, becoming the worst maritime disaster in American history, even worse than the sinking of the Titanic or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. By dawn, there were several small boats searching for any survivors. For over a month, bodies were found in the river. Each night, dozens would rise and silently drift away to be discovered the following day. Yet, only 197 bodies were ever found, and then they were buried in a mass grave in Memphis. David Gibson was found hanging onto a scrap of wood 9 miles downstream the day after the sinking of the Sultana. His brother James was never found. In total, 355 men from Company I of the 3rd Tennessee Volunteer Cavalry perished that night. David Gibson was one of the only men to return home to the mountains of East Tennessee, where he would live for the rest of his life and never fully recover from the injuries he sustained during the explosion.
David Gibson lived quite the remarkable life. Born just a few miles from here in what's now known as Blount County, Tennessee, in the Great Smoky Mountains. A mountain boy who was swept up in the Civil War, wearing the blue, where he was captured and thrown into one of the worst prisons of the Civil War for 7 months, only to be freed and put on that ill-fated ship on the Mississippi River, where over 1,500 people tragically died, and he somehow survived those icy waters and lived to tell the tale and make it back home here to the Great Smoky Mountains. Now, he began applying for his official Civil War pension in 1882 because of all the stuff he inhaled during that explosion on that ill-fated night. However, the government denied him time after time. For 18 years, they refused to pay him for his service to his country. When finally, in October of 1900, they gave him a government pension of $6 a month. But tragically, David would only receive $18 as he died from his injuries just 3 months later. David Gibson, quite the remarkable life. Thank you so much for your service to our country, and may your story forever be remembered.
So there you go, my friend. Now you know the true story of David and James Gibson, 2 mountain boys whose story has nearly been forgotten. It's my hope that you'll share this story with your family and friends to help honor them. Thanks so much for watching this episode, and be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.